There are days that etch themselves into the soul of a town not because of what happened, but because of what never came back. May 12th was a Monday, a cloudy one, and in the quiet community of Willow Creek, the morning began with the usual slow pace of spring. The school buses arrived one by one, their engines rumbling like familiar lullabies outside Willow Creek Middle School. Birds rustled in the maples along Maple Avenue. Parents waved. Laughter echoed. No one sensed the void that was about to unfold. 16 students from the 7th grade class boarded a cream-colored school bus scheduled for a trip to Chestnut Hollow Wetlands Preserve. The preserve was a modest stretch of protected land 30 miles southeast, filled with wooden walkways, birdwatching towers, and signs reminding children not to feed the raccoons. It was a standard educational trip, the kind that passed unnoticed in a school calendar full of similar events. The students were chosen based on a rotating schedule, and that year the selection had fallen on Mr. Baker's homeroom. Curiously, the trip had not originally been slated for May 12th. Parents remembered signing consent forms weeks earlier for a May 14th departure. Yet, over the weekend, an automated message from the school's front office confirmed the change and assured all families the itinerary remained the same. No reason was offered for the adjustment, and no one questioned it too deeply. The weather forecast warned of light rain later in the afternoon. Otherwise, everything seemed ordinary. That morning, the children wore light jackets and held bagged lunches. They carried notebooks and wore name tags made from laminated cardstock. Their faces held the excitement of a day away from math class. The bus assigned Vehicle 87B waited in the staff parking lot, where substitute driver Henry Dalton stood beside it holding a clipboard. No one remembered seeing him around school before, but substitute drivers were not uncommon, especially during the flu season. He was a tall man with a gray baseball cap, sunglasses, and a badge clipped to his windbreaker. At 7:45 a.m., the bus pulled out. A few teachers waved, a few parents lingered by the fence. One of the students, Jamie Langford, tossed a final glance toward the building before taking her seat. In that last photo taken by another student's disposable camera, and developed later from a roll found at home, Jamie's expression was unreadable. It was not fear. It was not joy. It was just frozen time. By midday, no call came from the preserve. There were no postcards from park rangers or bus drivers phoning ahead to report delays. The school secretary noticed around 1:30 that the bus had not returned. She assumed they were behind schedule and sent a brief note to the principal's office. At 3:15, the final bell rang and the 16 children were still absent. Teachers stood in the hallway waiting, glancing at each other with growing concern. The calls to the preserve were not answered. The preserve's office line rang out 4 times before an answering machine picked up. At 4:15, a janitor named Greg Washburn mentioned he had seen the bus earlier that day heading west instead of south. He said nothing initially because he assumed they had changed plans. At 4:45, Principal Merrill contacted the local police department, initiating a wellness check. At 5:20, the first officer arrived at the preserve. The entry gate was locked. No vehicle had signed in, no visitors had been recorded, no footprints on the trails, no tire marks in the gravel lot, no children, no bus. That evening, 16 families gathered in the gymnasium. The district superintendent spoke in clipped, nervous tones. The sheriff stood behind him with warm arms crossed. By then, dusk had fallen. The clouds had thickened, the air was damp, and the quiet in the gymnasium was only interrupted by the sharp gasp of one parent whose child had asthma and needed medication around dinner time. The sound echoed like a crack through plaster. The investigation began that night, but from the start there were strange inconsistencies. The preserve staff insisted the trip had not been scheduled for that day. They had no record of any school event or booking from Willow Creek on May 12th. A ranger even recalled declining a school request because the date conflicted with a habitat survey. Yet, the school's files included a revised itinerary dated 2 days prior and signed by the assistant principal. That signature matched the assistant principal's handwriting. He denied writing it. He insisted the document had never crossed his desk. Parents reviewed the voicemail message they had received from the school's automated system. It confirmed the trip had been rescheduled. When asked who recorded the message, the school's administrative assistant, Miss Ellen Roach, hesitated. She claimed she had recorded a message for a different field trip, not the wetlands trip. Her voice was not on the one parents heard. When the voicemail server was checked, the recording was missing from the system. The call logs had been purged at precisely 6:03 a.m. on Monday morning, just as the bus was leaving. That night, Sheriff Brody held a press conference on the steps of Town Hall. He assured the public that every road out of Willow Creek was being monitored. The FBI was being notified. A helicopter was dispatched to scan major routes using infrared sensors. All public and private land within a 30-mile radius would be searched. He urged calm. He promised action. Behind him, mothers clutched each other. Fathers stood stiffly, swallowing the tension that would not leave their throats. The town was no longer a place of calm silence. It was a place holding its breath. In the following days, search parties swept the roads, combed the fields, scoured the shallow rivers. Nothing emerged. Not a scrap of paper, not a tire track, not a dropped glove. No sightings. No sounds. The story made local news, then national news. For a week, Willow Creek was on every television set in America. Then the headlines moved on. The 16 children of Willow Creek Middle vanished on a day they were never supposed to leave. A driver who was not supposed to be there picked them up. A trip that was never supposed to happen was rescheduled by no one. A voicemail that no one recorded was sent to every parent. A bus drove away and did not return, and the town left behind began to fracture. Grief seeped into its bricks and sidewalks. The quiet streets grew quieter still, and above them all loomed the closed steeple of an old church no one visited anymore. That church stood on the edge of the woods. Its doors chained, its windows dusty. Its sign still read Sunday service at 9. But no one had prayed there in years. No one had looked behind it either. Not until much later. Not until the drone flew overhead and something rusted caught the sun. When the search expanded beyond Willow Creek, investigators turned their attention toward Henry Dalton, the substitute bus driver who had been hired just 3 weeks before the disappearance. At first glance, his employment records appeared routine. He had provided a social security number, a mailing address in nearby Elmford, and references from a local temp agency that handled substitute staffing for multiple school districts. His file included a driver's license and a fingerprint clearance card, both photocopied and stapled neatly into his personnel folder. The signature on his application matched the one on his license. Nothing stood out as a red flag until the sheriff's department attempted to contact him for questioning. The address Dalton listed led to an empty lot. The street number existed, but the lot had been vacant for more than 8 years. Neighbors recalled that a trailer used to sit there, but it had been towed away long ago. No mail had been delivered to the property in years. When detectives visited the temp agency that had forwarded Dalton's name to the school, they found it closed. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, "Office moved." A forwarding address led to an accounting firm that had no record of the agency ever existing. That was the moment investigators realized that Henry Dalton, or whoever had used that name, might not exist at all. The Social Security number attached to Dalton's employment application had once belonged to a man from Idaho who died in 1983. His death certificate was located in a federal archive in Spokane. There was no indication that anyone had tampered with the record, but someone had clearly used the number since at least 1990. Surveillance footage from the school, limited to a single grainy camera in the faculty parking lot, showed the bus arriving that morning and Dalton climbing in. He wore sunglasses and a windbreaker with a school badge clipped to it. The footage captured only his profile. The badge was never recovered. As more details emerged, investigators focused on Dalton's previous work history. According to the forms he submitted, he had worked for a Christian summer camp called Pines of Faith for 4 years before relocating to Willow Creek. The camp had been shuttered in 1989 following multiple citations for health violations and child supervision infractions. A local journalist who had covered the camp's closure remembered a quiet scandal surrounding missing donations and unlicensed caretakers, but no criminal charges were ever filed. When detectives reviewed the old camp files, they found employment logs handwritten in ledgers. No entry for Henry Dalton existed. This revelation intensified concerns that Dalton was a fabricated identity. A forensic handwriting analyst compared his job application to the field trip itinerary, both of which had been signed within days of each other. The analyst concluded that the same person likely wrote both signatures, but neither matched any known school employee. A theory formed that the entire trip had been organized using internal documents forged to appear legitimate. If that was true, then the person who impersonated Dalton might have had access to the school's administrative systems. Someone had gone to great lengths to make the trip appear real. 2 weeks after the disappearance, a small detail surfaced from an unexpected source. An elderly bus mechanic named Paul Derry came forward recalling that he had performed a tire rotation and brake check on vehicle 87B 2 days before the field trip. He remembered Dalton bringing in the bus personally. Derry said Dalton had asked unusual questions about how long the bus could idle before overheating and whether the GPS tracker had ever worked. The school's buses were not equipped with tracking systems, but the question lingered in Derry's memory because of the way Dalton had asked it, as though he expected surveillance and was relieved to learn it did not exist. This interaction prompted investigators to examine the school's bus logs. There, they found something alarming. The form logging vehicle use for May 12th was missing. Every other form for the month was present, neatly filed, initialed, and dated, only that one day had vanished. The secretary in charge of logging transportation requests swore she remembered stamping the form herself. She described the request as unusually specific. It listed not only departure time and location, but also a scheduled return path and gas station stop. Her memory of that detail stood out because she'd never seen a form so meticulously completed before, yet the document was gone. Meanwhile, a new witness emerged. Margaret Lacey, a retired schoolteacher who lived 2 blocks from the main road leading out of Willow Creek, claimed she saw a cream-colored school bus parked outside St. Emery's Church just after 8 a.m. on May 12th. She had not mentioned it earlier because she assumed the bus had broken down. At the time, she paid no attention. It was not until news reports repeated the vehicle number and description that she remembered the license plate. She recalled the last 3 characters were 8M2, which matched the district records for 87B. Her statement was dismissed initially due to her age and a past history of confusion during a previous police interview regarding a separate case. However, after reviewing her testimony, investigators returned to the grounds of St. Emery's Church. The church sat at the edge of town surrounded by overgrown brush and disused fences. Its parking lot had long been cracked by frost and weeds. The building itself had been abandoned since 1984, after a fire damaged its rear annex. No one had bothered to maintain it. No one had ever thoroughly searched behind it either. 3 officers and a state cadaver dog unit walked the grounds while Margaret stood nearby, clutching a photo of her late husband who had once served as the church organist. The dog circled the rear perimeter, pausing near a cluster of overgrowth where the old drainage ditch ran beneath the slope. Nothing visible suggested a buried vehicle. No fresh soil, no tire marks, no debris. Yet the dog barked twice and refused to leave the spot. A forensic team returned later that week with ground-penetrating radar. Within an hour, they located what appeared to be a large metallic object just under the earth. The shape was rectangular, the size consistent with a school bus. The discovery was not publicized. Not yet. The sheriff wanted confirmation before telling the families. A crew was dispatched to clear the brush and prepare for excavation. As the first layer of earth was stripped away, a thin strip of rusted metal came into view. The paint beneath the dirt had once been cream-colored. A faded stripe ran along the metal panel, interrupted by a series of numbers. Investigators crowded around. One of them rubbed the rust with a cloth. The numbers appeared slowly, like breath on a mirror. They read 87B. The the same bus that had disappeared over 3 decades earlier. The news of the discovery behind St. Emery's Church did not remain quiet for long. Though the sheriff had intended to keep the operation confidential until results were confirmed, rumors spread fast in a town where silence had already worn thin. A city maintenance worker named Donnie Hayes, who had been subcontracted to help clear the overgrowth, told his brother-in-law who mentioned it at a local diner. Within 48 hours, the story appeared in a local online blog. The article featured an aerial photo taken from a drone showing a rectangular disturbance in the earth just beyond the church's rear property line. The caption read, "Possible burial site of missing Willow Creek school bus." By the end of the week, satellite news vans were parked on the outskirts of the church. Parents of the missing children stood behind yellow caution tape gripping framed photographs and candles. Some wore shirts printed with the names of their children in fading block letters. The excavation had barely begun. The forensic crew worked with deliberate care, peeling back soil layers to avoid damaging potential evidence. After 2 full days of work, they uncovered the bus's roof, rusted but unmistakable. Its emergency exit hatch had collapsed inward, and the windows had long since shattered under the weight of soil and time. On the 3rd day of the dig, the forensic team reached the front of the vehicle. The windshield had imploded and the hood had caved. The bus's license plate, though corroded, remained partially legible. It confirmed what many already feared. This was Vehicle 87B, the one that had left Willow Creek with 16 students and never returned. Investigators opened the main door slowly. Inside, the smell of damp earth and mildew rose like a wave. Rotting fabric, decomposed foam from the seats, and clumps of moss clung to the floor. The rows of seats had collapsed under pressure. What remained was a skeletal interior filled with shadows and fragments. Tucked behind one of the front seats, the team found a backpack with the initials LW stitched into the fabric in black thread. Laura Whitmore had been one of the students on the trip. Her parents had spoken to the press only once in the past 3 decades, preferring to keep their grief private. When informed of the find, her father came in person, stood at the edge of the site, and silently pressed his hands against the temporary fencing. In another seat, investigators recovered a cracked lunch container filled with what remained of a sandwich, wrapped in wax paper, and a small drawing of a house under a blue sky. 2 seats from the back, they uncovered a laminated attendance sheet torn in half. Only 7 names were legible. The rest had disintegrated. Further toward the rear, they discovered a spiral notebook partially soaked in water damage. A child's handwriting in blue ink filled several pages. Most of the words had faded, but one sentence stood out written on the last intact page. "Miss R. said we are going to a different place, but not to tell." The writing stopped abruptly, after that followed by a scribbled line as though the child had hesitated or been interrupted. The discovery of the name, Miss R., reignited suspicions among the investigative team. That name had never appeared in the official faculty list for the trip. No teacher by that initial had been employed at Willow Creek Middle in 1991. When school records were re-examined, the staff member assigned to the trip was listed as Mr. Gordon Baker, the same man who had taught 7th grade homeroom. However, Baker had fallen ill that weekend and submitted a written notice that he would not attend. The substitute for that field trip had never been clearly identified in later records. The name was missing from the final itinerary. Detectives began reviewing photographs and yearbooks from the 1990 and 1991 school years. In a staff group photo from spring 1991, a young woman appeared near the edge of the image unidentified, standing several feet from the others. Her presence was unexplained, and her appearance did not match any known employee. She wore a plaid skirt and a dark cardigan, and in the photo she held a folder close to her chest. The school secretary at the time, now retired and living in Tampa, was contacted and shown the photo. She'd said the woman looked familiar, but could not remember her name. She recalled only that the woman arrived sometime in April and left before summer. As the investigation widened, more unsettling details emerged. A prayer card had been found wedged in the door of the church's rear annex. It featured a saint's image and a handwritten list of 5 children's first names on the back. All 5 names matched those of students who had vanished on the trip. The date written on the card was May 5th, 1 week before the disappearance. The ink had smudged, but was still legible. It raised a disturbing possibility that someone had anticipated or even planned the event in advance. Investigators searched church records and discovered that St. Emery's had never officially sold the land it occupied. After the fire in 1984, the property had passed into the hands of a religious preservation trust that no longer had an active board. The trust had been administered through a post office box in Dayton. When they tracked the box down, they found it had been inactive since 1996. Inside the church, most of the furniture had been stripped or vandalized. The pews were missing. The pulpit had collapsed. But behind the altar, inside a hollow cavity in the wall, a metal box was discovered. It contained old offering envelopes, a faded hymnal, and 3 undeveloped film canisters marked Summer 91. The film was rushed to a forensic photo lab in Richmond. 2 of the canisters were too damaged to produce images. The third contained 3 blurry frames. One showed a row of children lined up beside a rusted fence, possibly behind the church. The second showed a woman with dark hair holding a clipboard. The third showed the cream-colored school bus with the back emergency door open. No timestamp appeared, but the visual alignment with the current layout of St. Emery's grounds confirmed the images were real. More chillingly, the image of the woman matched the unidentified staff member from the yearbook photo. At the request of the sheriff, the photo was enhanced and compared to DMV records from the early 1990s. The system returned a match. The woman in the image had once held a teaching certificate in Virginia under the name Rebecca Lynn Monroe. Her credentials had been revoked in 1987 for falsifying experience records. She had worked under aliases at 3 different schools in 2 states, always disappearing when questioned about her employment history. Her current whereabouts were unknown. She had never filed taxes after 1992. Her last known address had been a shared residence in northern Georgia. That property was now abandoned. With the discovery of Rebecca Lynn Monroe's identity, the investigation's focus shifted fully onto St. Emery's Church and its forgotten surroundings. The structure, long abandoned and encased by decades of vegetation, had always stood like a decaying monument on the edge of town. Most residents drove past without giving it a second glance. Over the years, the property had been dismissed as unsellable due to conflicting land deeds, and no formal inspection had taken place since a preliminary fire report in 1984. After the partial uncovering of the bus and the items found within, investigators secured warrants to perform a full structural search of the building, including areas previously untouched. When the crew returned, the first floor was rechecked with better lighting. Several side rooms once used for Sunday school had collapsed roofs and mold-ridden furniture, but in the back hallway that led to the old kitchen, one officer noticed something strange about the paneling along the baseboards. A few of the wood planks had been re-nailed with mismatched brads newer than the rest of the decayed wall. When pried loose, the space behind revealed a narrow crawl space less than 3 feet high. Crawling inside with protective gear, the officer reached a small wooden crate wrapped in black cloth. Inside were old hymn sheets burned at the edges and a thin ledger with the word "Receipts" etched in block letters across the cover. The ledger contained dated entries spanning 6 years from 1985 to 1991. Most of the entries listed basic utility charges and modest Sunday collections. However, beginning in spring of 1988, a new category appeared on the second column of the pages. It was labeled simply deliveries. The first few entries were sparse, but by 1990 they grew more frequent with handwritten notations beside some of them. Several were marked with the name Dalton, in smaller handwriting, the same name used by the substitute bus driver in the disappearance. One entry dated May 12, 1991, stood out. It read, "Delivery confirmed," with 2 sets of initials, RLM and HD. The date matched the field trip exactly. Investigators brought the ledger to the evidence lab, where handwriting analysts compared the initials to other samples collected from the forged school documents. The results strongly suggested the entries had been written by the same person who signed the substitute bus driver's employment file. More alarming, the initials RLM matched the confirmed identity of Rebecca Lynn Monroe. It appeared both figures had maintained a written record of their involvement disguised within the mundane church finances. This placed Monroe and the impersonator together at the church on the day of the event. In the back of the church, the team cleared out what remained of the organ loft. Beneath a layer of soot and ash from the long-ago fire, they uncovered fragments of clothing. Tucked behind the pipes was a small child's jacket with a plastic toy car still lodged in the pocket. The jacket's color had faded, but a tag on the inside collar bore the name Brian E. in permanent marker. Brian Ellsworth had been one of the missing students. His parents were brought in to identify the jacket. Though weathered by time, they recognized it instantly. His father broke down quietly in the hallway, sitting against the cold plaster wall with his head in his hands. The condition of the jacket confirmed it had not been burned. It had simply been forgotten amid the rubble, perhaps overlooked during a hasty cleanup. As the search continued, investigators turned their attention to the church's property lines. Historical maps showed a discrepancy between the land the church legally owned and the land it physically occupied. To the rear of the building, past a rusted fence, and into the forested incline, there were 3 acres of undeclared woodland once zoned for expansion. The title for that parcel had never transferred legally. It remained in the name of the original diocese, which had dissolved decades earlier. When the team began clearing that area, they discovered remnants of old utility piping and concrete foundations half buried in moss. One structure, square and flat, had a rotted wooden door covered in vines. Underneath, a stairwell descended into the dark. It led to a basement room without windows, likely used for storage in the early days of the church. At the base of the steps, mold and mildew had overtaken the air. The walls bore flaking paint and faded religious murals. In the center of the room sat a long table, its legs rusted, its surface coated in dust. On the far wall, investigators found a series of photographs glued to corkboard, mostly destroyed by humidity. Only fragments remained. One image showed a school bus parked at an angle, partly obscured by trees. Another, badly discolored, showed children seated in rows inside what looked like a chapel. The walls and stained glass resembled those of St. Emery's. On a shelf nearby, wrapped in cloth, were 5 sets of student ID cards from Willow Creek Middle School. They had been placed together, organized by name, still legible despite the passage of time. Each ID showed the same field trip date on the back. The sheriff's team began cross-referencing the names on the IDs with those on the field trip list. All 5 matched children whose remains had not yet been recovered. This discovery intensified efforts to search the surrounding soil. Cadaver dogs returned, and soon markers were placed along a faint footpath running parallel to the basement wall. Soil samples revealed high traces of calcium phosphate consistent with human decomposition. At 2 feet beneath the surface, small bone fragments were discovered mixed with cloth fibers and rusted buttons. The lab later confirmed the remains were juvenile. The church's cemetery records, which had been assumed destroyed in the fire, were found archived in a municipal storage unit under St. Emery's name. Curiously, a series of burial plots had been registered in the years following the fire, despite the cemetery no longer being in use. Most of these plots were unnamed, marked only with numbers. The man who had signed the documents for the burial designations was listed as a part-time groundskeeper named Malcolm Ridley, but no one in town recalled such a person. The address listed for him belonged to a boarding house in Harper County, which had burned down in 1994. There were no known surviving records. The church had not hosted a service in over 3 decades yet. It had seen activity. Deliveries, ledgers, partial identities, and fake contracts had all converged on this one crumbling structure. It was no longer viewed as a ruin. It had become a central piece in a carefully constructed deception. The absence of footprints, the quiet disappearance, the lack of initial evidence had not been a failure of search teams. It had been the result of meticulous planning. The town that once dismissed St. Emery's as forgotten now realized how deliberately that perception had been crafted. What they thought was abandonment had in fact been secrecy. The walls that once echoed hymns had instead muffled confessions too monstrous to speak aloud. With each brick examined, with each artifact recovered, the story of Willow Creek's missing children emerged from behind the rotted wood and faded scripture no longer hidden behind locked doors. The discovery of the ledger entries, the hidden crawlspace, and the crude basement chapel had unearthed more than physical evidence. It had disrupted the fragile silence that had settled over Willow Creek for years. The town had grown used to unanswered questions. Families had lived with empty chairs and faded photographs for 3 decades. Now, with the truth beginning to show through the layers of dirt and decay, people were watching again. They came to the fences around St. Emery's. They stood in silence. They left flowers without names. What had been rumor was becoming history, and history demanded witnesses. One of those witnesses came unexpectedly. Nora Blake, a junior at the local community college, was working on a digital archive of lost religious landmarks across Virginia. Her professor had tasked her with documenting abandoned structures using drones. St. Emery's had been one of the sites she filmed earlier that spring. She reviewed the footage as part of a midterm assignment and noticed something strange in one of the frames. Behind the church, partially hidden beneath a thicket of overgrown trees, was a large rust-colored object. It appeared too rectangular and symmetrical to be natural. She had assumed it was scrap metal and moved on. After reading an online article about the investigation, she revisited the footage and recognized the color and shape as consistent with what had been reported about the buried bus. She sent the footage to the sheriff's department. It became the earliest confirmed aerial documentation of the area before excavation. Investigators reviewed the drone's path and noticed something else. In a separate clip filmed from the opposite angle, a man could be seen standing near the church's back wall. His face was not clear, but he appeared to be watching the sky. He wore a baseball cap and held something in his hand that reflected light. Nora had not seen him during the flight. The sheriff's team enhanced the image and distributed it to local law enforcement. A city worker named Miguel Jensen identified the man as Harold Lowry, a retired maintenance contractor who had worked on the town's zoning commission during the 1990s. His name had never appeared in any of the earlier records tied to the case, but he had overseen land permits for both church-adjacent properties and several other abandoned parcels near the forest perimeter. When questioned, Lowry denied any involvement and claimed he had merely been walking through the area on the day of the drone flight. Lowry's statement did not hold up under scrutiny. Investigators pulled town zoning records and discovered that Lowry had signed off on a permit in 1991 for temporary equipment storage behind St. Emery's. The permit was submitted under the name of a non-existent company and approved the week before the disappearance. A second document, dated 2 weeks later, showed that the permit had been canceled and the property declared unsafe for development. Lowry had signed both forms. His explanation when confronted was that the records must have been altered after his retirement. Authorities obtained a search warrant for Lowry's residence. Inside a storage cabinet in his garage, they found a faded church bulletin from 1991 with the initials HD written on the corner. It matched the initials found in the church ledger. They also uncovered a box containing cassette tapes labeled with years and months. Most of the tapes were blank or contained recordings of radio broadcasts, but one tape labeled May 91. Tripp had degraded audio that began with vehicle noise and ended with what sounded like a series of voices reciting scripture. The final minutes of the tape featured a child's voice saying a line that investigators would later confirm matched a sentence from one of the torn notebooks found inside the bus. News of the tape leaked to the media. The press swarmed Willow Creek. Reporters knocked on doors. Microphones were shoved through the windows of parked cars. Some residents avoided town center entirely. Others stood at the courthouse demanding the state open a formal inquiry. What began as a local tragedy was now a national scandal. Federal agents joined the investigation. A forensic linguist was brought in to analyze the tape. They confirmed that the voice on the recording likely belonged to one of the missing children based on comparisons with old school recordings submitted by the families. As the investigation reached deeper, the press turned its attention to other connections. A local history enthusiast, Carson Bell, published an article online detailing the history of religious foundations in the region. His research uncovered a pattern. Several properties linked to former churches in nearby counties had been acquired by shell organizations in the late 1980s. These groups, operating under names like Children's Hope Initiative and Mission Meadow Outreach, had ties to the same P.O. boxes and addresses used in zoning forms connected to St. Emery's. All had dissolved within a year or two of the Willow Creek disappearance. One of those properties was located 40 miles west of Willow Creek and had been sold in 1992 to a real estate holding company that never developed it. Carson shared this information with federal agents who traveled to the site. It had once belonged to a now abandoned retreat center. Inside one of the remaining cabins, they found a faded mural depicting children standing in a circle around a figure with outstretched arms. The art style matched the murals in St. Emery's basement. The same paint colors, the same brush technique. The artist's signature in the corner read RM initials consistent with Rebecca Monroe. The retreat center also held a locked cabinet beneath the floorboards of its main lodge. Inside were dozens of old school photographs clipped from yearbooks across multiple states. Some of the schools were in Michigan, others in Georgia. Most of the photos were labeled only with the school year and grade. Several featured students who had been declared missing in unrelated cases throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. Investigators cross-referenced these names with national databases and found 7 confirmed matches. This discovery expanded the scope of the case far beyond Willow Creek. It no longer looked like a single incident. It looked like a coordinated operation. Back in Willow Creek, another voice came forward. An anonymous letter arrived at the sheriff's office, handwritten in blue ink. It read simply, "You are looking in the right place, but the second door was always meant to stay shut." The writing bore similarities to the note found in the school bus notebook. Forensic analysts could not confirm a match, but the phrasing suggested knowledge of the church's layout and possibly its history. Investigators returned to St. Emery's and reviewed blueprints dating back to its original construction. A forgotten stairwell had once connected the main chapel to a cellar room later sealed during renovations. They found the bricked-in doorway behind the main altar partially obscured by fallen plaster. When removed, it revealed a set of steps descending into a stone chamber with no electricity and no natural light. In the center of the room stood a wooden chair facing a wall. On that wall were dozens of tally marks scratched into the paint. On the chair lay a rosary made from wooden beads. The beads were sticky with age and dirt. Under the chair sat a child's shoe with a cracked sole. The chamber behind the sealed doorway shook the investigative team in ways no previous discovery had. Though it measured only 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep, the room felt suffocating. Its stone walls were bare except for the scratched tallies on the far side. No lights had ever been wired into the space. No furniture besides the wooden chair had survived. The air inside was stale and damp like a crawlspace that had not been touched in decades. Forensic technicians moved carefully through the room, documenting every object and stain every groove in the walls. The child's shoe beneath the chair was identified by its faded label as belonging to Sarah Jansen, one of the younger students on the missing list. Her parents had submitted a photo of her shoes to the original investigation in 1991. The image had been clipped to her missing child flyer. The shoe's leather had partially crumbled from moisture, but the toe area was still intact. Lab testing revealed soil particles matching the terrain behind St. Emery's. The heel contained a small piece of folded paper wedged inside, almost invisible to the naked eye. When gently unfolded, it revealed a crudely drawn figure of a girl with the dark hair standing in front of a sun. The lines were smudged. No name appeared on the drawing, but the handwriting at the bottom read, "She was nice to me." The ink was faded, but the words had not vanished. The forensic linguist assigned to the case confirmed the handwriting bore strong similarities to other fragments recovered from the bus notebooks. The concrete floor beneath the chair was uneven. One corner seemed artificially patched. Investigators used sonar imaging to examine the base and discovered a cavity beneath the slab, roughly the size of a small trunk. With a jackhammer and hand tools, they removed the top layer of cement and exposed a rusted metal box. Inside were items wrapped in cloth and sealed plastic sleeves. Among them were several school IDs, including 2 for students not officially listed on the field trip roster. Their names did not appear on any school documentation submitted for the May 12th excursion. Their faces were unfamiliar to the teachers and families who had followed the case. This finding triggered immediate concern. If there were children on that bus whose identities had not been recorded by the school, it suggested the roster had been altered or forged before departure. These unknown children had not been missed in Willow Creek because they may not have been from Willow Creek at all. Fingerprint analysis of the IDs did not match any existing juvenile databases, but one partial match suggested a boy reported missing from Knoxville, Tennessee in 1990. His family had assumed he had run away from a foster home. His case had gone cold before the decade ended. Buried under the ID cards was a collection of photocopied documents bound by a rubber strap. They appeared to be lesson plans, all labeled with the header "The Foundation Curriculum." Each plan outlined activities centered on obedience, discipline, and spiritual cleansing. The language throughout the pages was clinical and vague, with no mention of specific religious texts. One page referenced a retreat called Path of Grace, scheduled annually between May and July. The retreat's listed location was a former summer camp near the Blue Ridge foothills. That camp had been purchased in 1989 by a nonprofit that dissolved after 2 years. Federal agents traveled to the campsite with ground radar and excavation tools. They found the buildings in ruins, overtaken by ivy and collapsed roofs. Beneath the main lodge, a crawlspace revealed several sealed storage crates. One contained children's clothing with embroidered tags from different states. Some items still had dry cleaning labels. Another box held composition notebooks, each marked by initials. The entries included drawings and half-written phrases often cut off mid-sentence. One entry read, "I am quiet so they do not move me again." Another read, "I miss the noise of school." Each notebook had been labeled with a numeric code that did not match any public school filing system. Meanwhile, back in Willow Creek, excavation around the church grounds continued. The cadaver dogs led the team toward the western slope where the land dipped sharply toward a dry creek bed. Metal probes struck a solid shape about 4 feet beneath the surface. Digging revealed the roof of what appeared to be a second vehicle much smaller than a bus, but large enough to transport passengers. It was an old delivery van stripped of markings. The interior had rusted beyond recognition, but within it lay several broken plastic seats bolted to the frame. A single metal plate recovered from the front dash carried the number 0247 engraved in shallow digits. Authorities traced the number to a long-defunct company registered in Delaware under the name Charter Vista Ministries. The company had operated under various aliases throughout the late 80s, claiming to provide transportation for underprivileged youth to educational retreats. No tax filings existed after 1993. The address associated with its registration was a mailbox at a mail forwarding center that no longer operated. This detail was critical. It aligned with the theory that these organizations had functioned as shells passing children from one site to another under the guise of religious or educational missions. Another grim discovery followed. At the edge of the excavation, partially buried beneath layers of root and rock, was a tightly coiled canvas tarp. It took 3 officers to unearth and unfold it. Inside were 2 school uniforms, both belonging to Willow Creek Middle School. One shirt had a name badge still clipped to the front reading E. Russell. Emily Russell had been one of the missing students. Her name and photo had been displayed in every annual memorial since 1992. Folded within the clothing was a lunchbox that still held an empty juice box and a plastic spoon. No other remains were found inside the tarp, but the discovery added weight to the timeline of the bus's burial. A map discovered in the metal box beneath the sealed chamber pointed to a trail known to locals as Moss Hollow Path. It had been closed since a landslide in the early 90s, but old survey maps showed it once connected to the rear boundary of St. Emery's land. The trail had bypassed major roads and ended near the same creek bed where the second van had been found. This route may have been used to move children or supplies between sites without being seen. When agents walked the length of the forgotten trail, they found a piece of blue ribbon tied around the branch of a dead tree. The ribbon's fabric matched others found in the basement room of the church. Further downstream, where the creek curved sharply, an investigator noticed a disturbance in the soil near a fallen log. A glint of metal caught his attention. It was a tin container dented and rusted but still sealed. Inside was a bundle of letters written in children's handwriting, each addressed to different names. Most began with phrases like, "I hope you are okay," or "I miss your stories." Some of the letters ended with drawings of faces or animals. One included a phrase that mirrored the earlier note found in the shoe beneath the chair. "She was nice to me." It was repeated again, this time underlined twice. The discovery of letters sealed in the tin container stirred something inside the investigative team. They were no longer just searching for facts. They were now piecing together voices that had never been heard. Each letter in the container was catalogued and preserved. Some were torn at the edges. Others were fragile with water damage, but the ink on most remained legible. One message repeated the same sentence 3 times in block handwriting. "I do not want to go again. I do not want to go again. I do not want to go again." Another was addressed to someone called Miss L, thanking her for reading stories in the evening. A sketch of a house drawn beneath the words included smoke curling from the chimney and stick figures holding hands near a tree. These notes, though written in innocence, carried a weight far beyond what the children who wrote them could have known. Back at the crime lab, a forensic document analyst made a quiet observation. Several of the letters had been written on identical lined paper using the same type of pencil. The pencil pressure slant and letter formations suggested that some of the writing may have been supervised or coached. Though each letter bore unique phrasing, they were remarkably consistent in structure. It raised the possibility that children were instructed to write certain types of messages, perhaps as part of an organized activity. This aligned with earlier findings from the Foundation curriculum documents that emphasized routine journaling and emotional restraint. The investigators noted that the handwriting began with stronger pressure and degraded in form over time, as if written by children who were exhausted or losing motor control. Agents returned to the old summer campsite where the notebooks had been recovered and began reviewing floorboards in the staff cabins. In one cabin, beneath a layer of warped oak planks, a team found a sealed compartment that held several VHS tapes wrapped in newspaper from 1990. The tapes were transported to a preservation facility where they could be played without damage. One recording showed a group of children entering a wooden building under the supervision of 2 adults. The children's faces were partially visible. Some wore clothing that matched items recovered from St. Emery's. The adults kept their faces turned away from the camera. A large wall calendar in the background confirmed the date as May 1991. During the same week, an assistant forensic anthropologist sifting soil samples near the second van found an unusual object. It was a broken necklace made of red plastic beads. Embedded in the clasp was a tiny photograph laminated beneath a clear dome. The image showed a young girl smiling with her front teeth missing. A former teacher at Willow Creek Middle School identified her as Cassidy Byrne, one of the students listed as missing. Her family had remembered that necklace as something she had made during Arts and Crafts Week the previous spring. The soil around the necklace contained trace amounts of calcium and phosphorus, suggesting human remains had once been nearby but had degraded beyond collection. At St. Emery's, the forensic team turned their attention to the pulpit, which had partially collapsed during initial searches. Beneath its base among the rubble, they found a small safe hidden behind an unmarked panel. The lock had rusted through. Inside were several pages from what appeared to be a visitor logbook, though many of the names were initials. One page, dated April 1991, had a symbol drawn beside the initials RLM and HD. The symbol matched the one found in the Foundation curriculum pages. It consisted of two overlapping circles with a small triangle in the center. No religious text was associated with the symbol. It did not appear in any mainstream theology database. A former cult deprogrammer consulted by federal agents recognized it as a glyph used by isolated spiritual movements, emphasizing separation and purification. Investigators reviewed missing persons databases across the region using new keywords derived from the symbol, the initials, and the Foundation's name. One case stood out. In 1990, a foster child named Troy Keller had vanished from a temporary home in Durham, North Carolina. His foster records mentioned a transfer to a church-based retreat center for behavioral evaluation. The name of the retreat had been blacked out in court documents, but a surviving memo referenced a trip arranged by a group called Grace Restoration Trust. That name matched the financial sponsor listed in zoning records connected to the St. Emery's property. A follow-up interview with the social worker assigned to Keller's case revealed that she had attempted to contact the retreat but never received a reply. The trust had ceased operating just months after the boy's disappearance. To understand the scope of this network, investigators traced the movement of vehicles registered under various dissolved religious foundations between 1988 and 1992. They discovered a pattern. Every spring, vans would travel between known properties for brief windows of 3 to 5 days. One such van, now decommissioned, had once belonged to a ministry group called Healing Steps Fellowship. The route logs, preserved through third-party vehicle maintenance reports, showed that one of these trips occurred on May 11, 1991, terminating near Willow Creek. That was the day before the school bus disappeared. The evidence continued to build. A retired postmaster in the nearby town of Dalton came forward with a memory. He recalled delivering parcels in the early 90s to a remote property listed under the name Beacon Education Initiative. He remembered the recipients rarely spoke, but one woman always signed her name as R. Monroe. She collected brown paper packages marked with coded labels and never gave a forwarding address. The postmaster filed an affidavit. A search warrant was granted for the property, which had since changed hands and been repurposed as a vineyard. Investigators were permitted to search its older structures. In a cellar beneath the former farmhouse, they located a locked steel cabinet bolted into the floor. Inside were dozens of manila folders, all labeled with codes. Many of the folders contained photographs, intake forms, and behavioral assessments of children under the age of 13. Each form listed dates, names, and phrases like emotional instability, excessive attachment, or ready for transition. Cross-referencing the names revealed that 3 of the children had been reported missing in separate states within a 2-year window. The language in the assessments mirrored the ideology expressed in the curriculum documents and letters. These children were being selected, documented, and categorized for relocation. The process had the structure of a system, not a coincidence. Back in Willow Creek, a new piece of information emerged from an unlikely place. A former janitor from the school named Paul Renner came forward. He had retired 2 years after the disappearance, but remembered a detail that continued to trouble him. The day after the field trip, he had returned to clean the classrooms and found a white envelope wedged beneath a radiator in the 7th grade hall. Inside were 3 bus permission slips signed with names he did not recognize. He gave them to the school office, but he never saw them again. Investigators searched the school archives. No record of the slips had ever been entered. This confirmed what many feared. Not only were additional children on that bus, but their identities had been erased from official records. Their presence had been concealed so completely that even those who worked inside the building did not recognize the names. The slips were signed, but the signatures did not match any parent or guardian listed in school files. This suggested that children may have been added at the last minute under forged documentation and never intended to return. Their disappearance was not a mistake. It was a design. And the echoes of their existence were finally starting to answer back. As investigators deepened their probe into the layers of forged identities and concealed histories, the trail began to circle back toward the enigmatic figure of Rebecca Lynn Monroe. Her initials had appeared at every significant junction of the investigation. Her handwriting had been found on forms her face had surfaced in archival photos, and her name had been connected to shuttered organizations that had moved children between remote properties. Yet she remained elusive. No verifiable employment history had been traced to her after 1992. No tax filings, driver's license renewals, or medical records had been submitted under her name in any state. It was as if she had vanished deliberately and completely. A facial recognition specialist working with the Department of Justice compared Monroe's known photograph to hundreds of school and organizational records spanning 3 decades. One match emerged from a 1996 image taken at a charter school in Colorado. The woman appeared under the name Marie Reller. Her posture, hairline, and eye spacing aligned closely with Monroe's. In that school's yearbook, she served as a curriculum assistant for a special enrichment program that lasted less than a year before being discontinued. The program had been funded by a grant from a now defunct educational foundation called Children's Path Forward, whose board included the same corporate address once used by Beacon Education Initiative. Federal agents tracked down a former employee from that charter school who remembered Marie Reller as polite, soft-spoken, and always private. She never gave a personal phone number and never attended staff gatherings. She resigned abruptly in the spring of 1997 and left no forwarding address. The former employee also recalled that Reller had brought in her own printed materials to teach from refusing to use the standard state curriculum. One of the packets was titled The Window of Stillness. Investigators recovered a copy from the school's old storage unit. The content focused heavily on obedience, structured silence, and exercises for resisting outside influence. The tone and vocabulary mirrored those found in the foundation curriculum used at St. Emery's and the Retreat Center. Through handwriting, comparison analysts confirmed that Monroe and Reller were the same person. Her trail had been cold for nearly 25 years. The breakthrough came when a long-shot data request matched her fingerprints to a 1984 arrest in Wisconsin under yet another name, Rachel M. Reese. She had been taken into custody during a protest outside a juvenile court. The charges were later dropped. Her arrest report noted that she refused to provide a full birth date and claimed she had been working with a ministry group dedicated to the spiritual rehabilitation of youth. That ministry, according to archived phone records, had received several calls in 1983 from the same number later associated with Grace Restoration Trust. A team of federal marshals was dispatched to a rural town in eastern Montana, where records showed that a property belonging to a woman named Margot Riley had received several pension deposits under a federal ID linked to Reese. The property was a modest cabin with no neighbors for miles. When officers arrived, they found it abandoned. Inside were traces of recent occupation, but no resident. On the kitchen table was a notebook with dated entries written in a neat, deliberate hand. Each entry was a reflection on solitude control and cleansing. The writing style matched Monroe's past documents. One entry, dated the week of the St. Emery's excavation, read simply, "The voices are finding me again." Beneath a floorboard near the bedroom, the team discovered a concealed tin box wrapped in plastic. It contained family photos, several IDs under different names, and a metal pendant matching the glyph found in the church ledger. Tucked beneath these was a faded newspaper clipping from 1991, reporting on the Willow Creek disappearance. A sentence had been underlined in red pencil. 16 students vanished on a field trip led by a substitute teacher and a temporary driver. Next to it, in handwriting that was sharp and angular, were the words, "They never knew who they were following." The phrase suggested that the children may have been misled not only by deception, but also by a false sense of purpose or mission. Further evidence connected Monroe to a small publishing house in Oregon that had quietly printed niche spiritual literature throughout the 1990s. The house had gone out of business in 2001, but archived print orders revealed one volume titled Bridges to Clarity had been printed under the pseudonym L.R. Mayer. The Library of Congress did not have a copy, but one used bookstore in Portland still carried a sealed edition. Inside, scribbled marginalia in pencil repeated familiar messages. Quiet makes you whole. Stillness builds truth. Movement is decay. The final chapter of the book referenced a gathering place called the Ridge of Listening, a location that had never been documented but sounded consistent with retreat center terminology. Investigators compiled every document, video, frame, witness statement, and object linked to Monroe. A profile emerged of a woman who had adopted at least 5 identities and operated across 3 decades under various nonprofit umbrellas. She had focused on children described as isolated, neglected, or transient. These children had been enrolled in temporary programs disguised as enrichment initiatives. Most were never seen again. Monroe's role had evolved from assistant to organizer. She had not acted alone, but the patterns of her movements and the consistency of her language suggested she had become central to the design of the broader operation. Among the manila folders recovered from the steel cabinet beneath the farmhouse, one file stood out. It included a sketch of a circle with radiating lines and the word eligible written underneath. The file listed only one name, Nolan Pierce. He had been 12 years old when he went missing from a shelter in Baltimore in 1989. The shelter's intake documents listed his history of mutism following trauma. The assessment described him as deeply internalized, obedient, and unlikely to resist redirection. No formal investigation had ever connected his case to any broader activity. His name appeared again in a document marked Year 3, with a coded date that matched the spring of 1991. DNA records for Nolan had never been collected due to his lack of family. However, a juvenile remains profile logged in the national database included markers consistent with a bone fragment recovered near the van site behind St. Emery's. The match was not legally definitive, but forensic anthropologists placed the probability at over 90%. The evidence strongly suggested that Monroe and her network had targeted children who could be removed from the system with minimal resistance or paperwork. Children without strong advocates. Children unlikely to be missed in bureaucratic chaos. Public pressure mounted as details of the investigation were disclosed in congressional hearings. The Justice Department faced questions about how so many organizations operating under false pretense had gone unchecked for so long. The press labeled Monroe as the central figure in a web of missing children cases previously thought unconnected. A portrait emerged not of a cult leader or religious zealot, but of a calculated manipulator who cloaked her purpose in soft language and institutional gaps. Her disappearance now became the focus of a multi-agency manhunt. As the search for Rebecca Lynn Monroe expanded nationwide, attention turned once again to the land behind St. Emery's. Despite months of excavation and investigation, there were still areas of the property left undisturbed. One particular section near the southwest corner had been marked on the oldest survey maps as unsuitable for development due to soil instability. The land sloped downward toward a gully shaded by towering oaks and choked with thorny underbrush. A second oak tree, larger than the others and noted on early records for its root system disrupting old fence lines, stood in isolation, its thick trunk split near the base. According to a historical topographic rendering from 1963, that portion of the land once included a small utility shed long since collapsed and overgrown. A surveyor noticed faint depressions in the ground surrounding the tree as if the soil had settled unevenly over time. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed in a grid pattern. Within an hour, the imaging detected a series of regular shapes, rectangular, and spaced evenly apart. Each measured roughly the dimensions of a small coffin. The sheriff ordered a full excavation. The work began at dawn and proceeded slowly layer by layer. The soil here was loamy and damp, complicating the process. By the second day, wooden remnants began to surface. The boards were brittle and fragmented, wrapped in root systems that had grown through them like veins through bone. Inside the first box, they found fragments of fabric, a shoe buckle, and the rusted casing of a lunchbox. No intact remains were preserved, but the soil carried high concentrations of calcium and phosphate, confirming prolonged human decomposition. The second box was more intact. Within it were several strands of braided hair neatly tied with colored ribbons. A dental plate with 3 baby teeth embedded in it was recovered. Forensic analysis later confirmed the dental pattern matched school health records of Marissa Young, a student listed among the original 16. The discovery confirmed what many had feared. The burial sites behind the second oak were not symbolic. They were deliberate and carefully planned. Further into the soil, a childish plastic recorder was found, the kind handed out in music class. Its surface was cracked, but initials scratched into the side read CM. Carl Monroe had been one of the quieter children in Mr. Baker's homeroom. His mother had recalled the recorder as the only item he insisted on bringing with him. Alongside the instrument lay a small paper envelope sealed in wax. Inside was a folded note that read, "You can only be clean if you do not go back." It was signed R. The handwriting matched that of Monroe, confirming her physical presence at the burial site. News of the discovery swept through Willow Creek. Families gathered behind the barrier, many for the first time in years. Some carried framed photographs. Others brought candles or handmade signs. The town council authorized a temporary memorial to be placed at the excavation site. A metal arch was installed bearing the names of the 16 original children etched into black stone. Beside it stood a single lantern that would remain lit each night until the investigation concluded. Schoolchildren who had never known the victims drew pictures that were laminated and fastened to the temporary fencing. One image showed a school bus rising from the ground with flowers growing out of its windows. Forensic anthropologists estimated that the burial site had once included at least 6 separate enclosures, though only 4 were intact enough to yield material evidence. The other 2 had been partially destroyed by water damage and tree roots. In the deepest section of the dig excavators unearthed a tin whistle, a piece of chalkboard, and a cracked mirror wrapped in cloth. A ribbon had been tied around the mirror with a note that read, "Let them see themselves as they were before." The language echoed phrases found in The Window of Stillness and the other writings recovered from Monroe's previous locations. Her ideology appeared to be centered not just on removing the children, but on reshaping how they saw themselves. A second van was located just beyond the tree line, buried beneath a partial rock slide. It had been stripped of its seats and repurposed as storage. Inside were several metal storage boxes. Within them, investigators discovered pages of documentation, some of it meticulously typed, other parts handwritten. These documents included intake evaluations, meal logs, and incident reports. Each entry listed children by first name, only followed by codes denoting their emotional state and recommended intervention level. One note referred to a child as resistant to transition and advised solitary reflection. This recommendation matched the layout of the sealed room discovered in the church basement. Among the papers was a photograph of a group of children standing in a circle near a building resembling the old retreat center. In the corner of the image, partially obscured by shadow, stood a woman in a long skirt holding a clipboard. Her face was turned, but her posture and clothing matched previous descriptions of Monroe. One child in the photo was circled in red ink with the word "pending" written below. The photo had no date, but its condition suggested it had been stored in the van for decades. Beneath it, a folder contained forms from different jurisdictions, many from group homes and shelters. These documents had been copied and altered. Some included dates changed by hand. The fraud was deliberate and structured. Back in the evidence lab, digital restoration experts pieced together audio fragments from the deteriorated VHS tapes. One clip recorded without the knowledge of its subjects captured a moment during what appeared to be a morning routine. A female voice instructed the children to line up and remain still while a prayer was read. The children repeated each line in unison. Their voices were flat, emotionless. The camera shook slightly, as if hidden or held under a jacket. At one point, a child coughed, and the voice halted the prayer. Silence followed. Then the voice said, "Begin again, quieter this time." The repetition began anew. The tone was not violent, but absolute. The recording lasted less than 5 minutes. At the University of Virginia, a team of researchers specializing in child trauma and institutional abuse were brought in to analyze the documents. They concluded that the methods described were indicative of psychological conditioning designed to sever ties to identity and previous environment. The goal they hypothesized was not physical harm, but ideological transformation. The language used throughout Monroe's materials had shifted over time, becoming less instructional and more devotional. Her writings moved from structured rules toward philosophical aphorisms, suggesting a progression from obedience to belief. This psychological transition was reflected in the final item recovered near the second oak. A box made of pressed wood wrapped in canvas and buried in its own shallow grave held a set of small wooden tokens. Each token bore a single word carved into it. Words like still pure return and vessel. These were the same words used in the Foundation's curriculum, the letters, and the guided journal entries. Beneath the tokens lay a piece of cloth embroidered with initials stitched by hand. It included 12 sets of initials. Not all of them matched the 16 known children. 4 were new. The discovery led to immediate reopening of several cold cases from surrounding states. In each case, the child had disappeared from a low-profile group home or unlicensed educational program. Records were incomplete or had been destroyed. But as the investigation unfolded, the question that began to haunt Willow Creek and the rest of the nation was no longer just how many were taken. It became how many had never even been counted. The final stage of excavation near St. Emery's was supposed to be procedural. The teams had covered every quadrant of the grounds, combed through all surrounding land parcels, and verified structures for any signs of concealment or decay. The last scheduled sweep was meant only to confirm that no new anomalies remained. That morning was clear and cold, and the light cut through the bare trees in angles that stretched long shadows across the exposed soil. By then, the site was cordoned off entirely, access restricted to a federal task force, forensic anthropologists, and 2 remaining cadaver dog units. The families who had waited months for answers stood behind the boundary fence, many of them silent, some clutching notebooks, others just holding photographs so worn the edges had curled inward. At the edge of the excavation zone, where the tree roots ended and the slope gave way to rocky earth, a deputy noticed a slab of concrete that did not match the natural formation of the ground. It was rectangular, approximately 5 feet long and 2 feet wide, with sharp edges and the faint imprint of a trowel pattern across the top. The concrete was shallow, less than a foot deep, and cracked in 2 places. Using hand tools, the team began lifting the broken sections. Underneath lay a rusted steel container secured with 2 latches. The metal had corroded, but the latches released with careful pressure. Inside the container, there was no clothing, no personal items, no fabric. Instead, it held documents. Dozens of them. The contents were dry and surprisingly well preserved. The container had been wrapped in an oilcloth lined with wax. Each document was labeled with a code and a date, most ranging from 1986 to 1991. The handwriting was familiar. The loops of the letters, the balance of the margins, the sharp peaks on capital letters all matched the confirmed writing of Rebecca Lynn Monroe. The first sheet was titled Foundation Participant Roster and included 2 columns of names. The left column listed first names only, while the right column carried 3-letter codes. One code appeared repeatedly. It read OBS, a designation that was later confirmed by the trauma psychologist to mean obedient but silent. Further down in the folder was a single-page ledger. It included dates, arrival times, transfer initials, and drop-off confirmations. The ledger listed 19 names. Of those, 16 matched the original roster of students from Willow Creek. The remaining 3 names had not appeared in any school records, any government reports, or any prior investigative files. Their presence in the ledger confirmed suspicions that children outside the district had been added to the group through forged documents and would have gone unnoticed had the tragedy not unfolded. The dates in the ledger aligned perfectly with the known disappearance timeline. On the rightmost column of the page, a final entry was written in smaller handwriting. It read, Archive closure initiated. Earth will hold the stillness. One of the folders contained identification photographs of children arranged in laminated sleeves. Some were printed from school portraits, others were clearly taken in haste. Two of the photographs showed children standing against a wall with a measuring chart behind them, indicating that intake assessments had been recorded. The backgrounds in several photos matched structures at the abandoned summer retreat. What struck investigators most was that every child in the photo looked forward without expression. No one smiled. No one looked away. The camera had captured stillness, the kind of stillness that Monroe had preached in her writings. These images became the center of the closing report issued to federal prosecutors. They were no longer just names on paper. They had faces again. With the physical evidence complete, investigators shifted focus to the financial structure that had sustained the operation. An analyst at the Treasury Department traced charitable donations made to foundations operated under Monroe's known aliases. The contributions were modest, often below the reporting threshold, but consistent. Many came from religiously affiliated trusts and corporate charity programs that never followed up on the use of funds. One nonprofit in particular had routed small monthly payments for 6 years to an address in Georgia, the same property later connected to Monroe's alias as Marie Reller. The money trail confirmed that this network had not functioned in isolation. It had been passively supported by systems that failed to demand accountability. Back in Willow Creek, the community began to prepare for a formal memorial. The town council designated a portion of land near the school to be redeveloped into a remembrance garden. Architects designed a circular path that would include 16 trees, one for each identified child, planted in a ring around a stone monument. The families agreed that the monument would carry not just the names, but also the last confirmed school photographs of each child. Underneath those photos would be a line from a notebook found inside the buried bus. The line read, "She said we could write to remember." The stone was cut from local granite and polished until it reflected light like glass. On the day of the dedication, nearly 300 people attended. Some had traveled from out of state, others were from neighboring towns who had watched the story unfold in silence. A choir of local students sang quietly while candles were placed around the trees. The names were read aloud slowly, one at a time. As each name was spoken, a child from the current school stepped forward to place a flower at the base of the tree. At the center of the garden, beneath the largest tree, a sealed box was buried. Inside were copies of the recovered letters, drawings, and notes from the children who had vanished. It would remain there, permanently encased in glass and concrete, its contents protected from the erosion of time. Federal charges were filed against surviving individuals who had indirectly supported the operation through falsified records and negligent oversight. Most of them had long since retired or relocated. Some cooperated, offering details that helped construct a timeline of how the network had expanded. Several shelters and group homes across 3 states were reinvestigated and closed. Policy changes were enacted at the federal level regarding the documentation and transfer of minors between institutions. A task force was established to review all unverified child relocation reports from the past 40 years. Monroe herself was never located. A final image, grainy and taken from a highway gas station camera in Idaho in 2004, was the last confirmed sighting. She appeared thinner, older, and alone. The story of Willow Creek became the subject of national debate and academic research. Some focused on the bureaucratic failures, others on the psychological patterns that enabled someone like Monroe to operate undetected for so long. Survivors of similar institutions came forward their testimonies, adding weight to the reform movement that followed. Books were written. A documentary series aired. But in Willow Creek, the story remained personal. The town did not speak of justice in the abstract. They spoke of memory, of stillness, of the unreturned. Teachers read excerpts from the recovered letters during Literature Week. Students created art projects about safety awareness and truth. A new elective course was added to the curriculum centered on ethics, identity, and care. The school bus remained in storage under federal custody. Plans were submitted to convert it into a permanent museum exhibit to be displayed with the consent of the families. The exhibit would travel state to state, bringing awareness to the signs of institutional abuse, the importance of record integrity, and the value of every child's voice. The final panel of the exhibit would display a simple sentence handwritten on yellow paper. The sentence read, "I wanted to come home, but I could not find the way." That line, recovered from the back cover of a soaked notebook, became the closing note of the investigation. It echoed across every courtroom, every archive, every memorial stone. If this story moved, you remember to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives based on real investigations. We would love to hear your thoughts about the plot and where you are watching from. Share your perspective in the comments below.